It gives me great pleasure to introduce Tema. Tema Stauffer is an American photographer based in Montreal. Her work has been exhibited at Sasha Wolf, Daniel Cooney, and Jen Beckman galleries in New York, as well as galleries and institutions internationally. She was awarded an AOL 25 for 25 grant for Innovation in the Arts in 2010 for her combined work as an artist, curator, and writer. She received the 2012 Women in Photography LTI Lightside Individual Project Grant, 2014 CCNY Darkroom Residency, and was the finalist for the Altwin Bouchever Portrait Competition 2013 that took place at the Smithsonian's National Portrait Gallery. She is currently an assistant professor of photography at Concordia. Please help me welcome Tema.
Hello, bonjour, hi everybody, and thanks for coming. Thanks to Ingrid for inviting me to speak, and thank you to my colleagues Marissa, Ramon, Genevieve, and Evergon for bringing me here this year. And thank you guys just for having me. It's been really fantastic to be part of this really supportive, open, progressive community, and I've been really it's a gift to be here. So I am gonna go back in time to a little bit after I got out of graduate school, and I grew up in the Midwest, and I went to graduate school in Chicago and graduated in 1998. And Genevieve was my professor, as some of you know. She was a visiting professor, and that's sort of the seed of my relationship to Concordia. Based on some of the work I had done as a graduate student, some documentary work, in the year 2000, at the new millennium, there was a project in Chicago to basically, hire photographers to document life in Chicago in the year 2000 to create an archive, which now exists at a library at the University of Illinois. And meeting with the editor, we arrived at the idea together that I would go on ride-alongs with police officers and photograph communities in Chicago. And it was actually a really difficult project to get off the ground because my first, initial calls to police departments were not successful. And I had started teaching, and I had a student who was a police officer, and that his district kind of opened the door to me being able to go on these ride-alongs. And once I got started, I was mostly with the District 7 on the south side of Chicago. So I spent, part of the year 2000 making these trips with police officers, and this is a photograph of an officer with a rifle confiscated from a Chicago housing project. And it's a kind of project where, full of kind of unknowns of what might happen and what we would find. And often what I was photographing was not so much an event, but the kind of residual impact on the community, the people that were surrounding some kind of, what in this case it was a domestic violence incident. And these are friends, neighbors of the related to the call, and they're sort of mourning the incident. So a lot of the experience was sort of the aftermath of something happening. And this is a photograph of a girl in her home in a housing project. One of the things that was happening in the year 2000 was that a lot of the projects were being evacuated because of the sort of problems that were arising with drugs and gangs and violence. And it was a very controversial project because people were also losing their homes and having to find new homes. And so it was kind of a sad, this call was going to the home of the officers, and they were the last remaining tenants. She and her grandmother were the last tenants in their home. And so many of these experiences, took place in environment. This is also a housing project of basketball players and 2 young girls. So I was just mostly looking at the community. And this is a photograph of a blood stain on a sidewalk after a fight between a police officer and someone who was drinking, and people got really riled up and felt like there was a violence from the police officer, and so there were a lot of incidents that I witnessed like that, a lot of conflict between the officers and people in the community. This call was for a man had died in his of natural causes in his apartment, and I had actually photographed the scene and I felt like that I didn't want to use a photograph that was that explicit. So this is an image of the officers removing his body from the apartment building. So that was kind of my beginning of documentary photography, and or following my graduate school working documentary photography. And then I moved to Minneapolis in 2001 and started making a really different kind of work for a while that wasn't so dealing with the urban environment. And it started with this image that I had taken in northern Michigan with my family, and I just had a tripod in the car and was just responding pretty spontaneously to the quality of light and sense of space. And this image had a big impact on just sort of shaping a new direction of a new way of making pictures. And this is also, these initial images are all shot in the Midwest. So for 4.5 years, I was living in Minneapolis, which, now being in Montreal, it has actually bringing back a lot of memories of my time there, including these very cold, snowy winter nights. And I think, the kind of work that I was looking at, I read an essay years ago by Gregory Crewdson talking about his influences and how Edward Hopper is kind of at the bottom of all of these influences in American photography, like him and Joel Sternfeld, Robert Frank, Diane Arbus, and so on. So that's the kind of work that I was really looking at, and also conscious of the kind of the Hopper sense of American space and some of these similar themes of loneliness and beauty and sort of the absence of people, but a sense of human presence as well. And I would to make these images, those were actually, where I lived, but I would sometimes make little road trips just explicitly for the purpose of finding things to photograph. And so this is a highway, generally like on the outskirts of the city. So I made these dusk and nighttime images, and this is a gas station. A number of these are, they're kind of man-made environments, but they're depopulated. And a lot of it's just about light and color and mood and trying to find, this kind of psychological atmosphere in these spaces. Sometimes I would make photographs on a drive. My parents live in Michigan, which is where I grew up, and I would make photographs on off the highway, driving in between Minneapolis and Michigan on I-94, and that would be a time both away from my daily life, but also just kind of away from the familiar and just being able to explore. This is a truck stop, so I was looking for a sense of atmosphere and not really knowing it, until I found the space, what that would be. So there's more of these Midwestern landscapes, and I had started exhibiting some of these images at a gallery in New York, an emerging gallery called Jen Beckman. And I was increasingly starting to make trips to New York in my last couple of years there. And I was, like many, American and beyond artists, I was feeling that pull of New York in terms of, sort of moving forward as an artist. And so in 2000, in 2005, I moved to New York City. And one of my considerations was, what was I going to photograph there? Because I didn't really think that I would be photographing New York, partly because it's so sort of frenetic and photographed and iconic, and I still felt like, you know, my place was in a kind of different sort of America. So I started to make road trips when I could, and I would leave New York for maybe a week, and that's how I would, you know, continue to make pictures. And these are from the first trip I made after moving to New York. This is in, I went to New Orleans shortly after Hurricane Katrina, and I had actually initially gone to photograph at the Angola Prison Rodeo, and then ended up driving around and trying to make pictures that were showing New Orleans, but without, you know, more sort of subtly and quietly, I guess, than some of the more explicit news pictures that documented the aftermath of the hurricane. And another trip I made in those earlier years, in that time, I went to Florida, and the sort of reason, the crux of the reason I had gone there was to photograph in this town called Gibsonton. The lore of Gibsonton is that it's the off-season dwelling place for circus and carny people, and I was sort of intrigued by that. There's actually an X-Files episode about Gibsonton. And I flew down there and I rented a car and just started driving around trying to figure out, like, you know, I think that its day of that kind of culture being really visible had faded, and there was sort of just traces of what remained of that. And this photograph came out of that, and I think this has been one of the more significant images from this series. And I think what you know, it was a very memorable experience taking this picture, just the kind of magic of looking through the viewfinder and watching this white horse run up and down the driveway. The horse was actually related to a show horse that had been part of this kind of carny culture. But I did some research after taking this picture, and the white horse in American folklore is actually a symbol of impending doom. And I felt like, you know, the picture has both a magic and a mystery, but also there's sort of a darker or sad current as well. And I think that those combined qualities were what was what I was looking for, and you know, making these kind of images. This is in Texas. My brother lives and teaches in Texas, and so I had the opportunity to make a lot of trips to Austin, so that became another space, another environment that I explored. And this image came out of, like the morning before I took this picture, I was talking to a friend on the phone and asking her, like, how could I sort of express anxiety in an image. And later that day I was driving around, this is in Dripping Springs, Texas, and I saw a sign for Dreamcatcher's Sleep Lab, and I thought it was intriguing. You know, I was intrigued by the idea of it, and went in and found these rooms with these kind of barren mattresses. And it's a sleep lab is a place where people go to have their insomnia and their anxiety evaluated. And so that to me became, you know, this kind of metaphor for you know, sense of this kind of anxiety. And this is an image inside the sleep lab of a looking through a curtain. This image is actually on the cover of a book that just came out by a writer who, when I was still living in Minneapolis, I was a big fan of his work. He's a Midwestern writer and teaches at the University of Minnesota. And I actually, you know, sent him this very passionate fan letter about 10 years ago, and he you know, wrote me back, and I woke up the next day to an email from him, and it was the beginning of what's been like a 10-year kind of friendship and mentorship, and he's been very supportive of my work and has collected some images and has written about the work. And so it's kind of an honor that he sent me this mock-up last spring to use this image for his book cover. He said his description was that he felt it was both inviting and sinister. So it's been I mean, one of the really important things for me as an artist has been to have mentors and to reach out to people whose work I respect, and that's led to some really interesting relationships. And this is another trip in 2008 that I made out west in the kind of Four Corners area. This is actually taken in Monument Valley, which is one of the seven wonders of the world, and I wanted to avoid trying to take like calendar art of the epic, Western landscape, but I felt like, with the car was a strong symbol for me of America and American power and American decline. This picture was actually published with an article called "A Colossal Wreck: Relics of American Empire," which just the title that they put this image with really kind of clicked. It made sense to me with what I was looking at. And this is a photograph in Colorado City in Utah, which is actually a fundamentalist Mormon community that I was interested in passing through after reading a book by John Krakauer called Under the Banner of Heaven. So a lot of for me, like reading and just finding like pieces of history or pieces of literature would be like a roadmap to make sense of where I would make trips, and that it didn't actually have to be, it's not like necessarily a documentary about the subject, but these pieces of history would just inspire me to visit these places. And this is also in Utah in the same area. This image was inspired by a passage from a book called The Executioner's Song, which it's a novel by Norman Mailer, and it's about Gary Gilmore, who was a convicted, he killed two people in the late 70s, and it's about this sort of doomed relationship he had with his girlfriend Nicole, and he got the death penalty and so on. But there's a passage in Norman Mailer's book where Gary had written Gary loves Nicole on a tree, and I visited the town of Spanish Fork and just drove around and sort of looked. This image is called Field of Sad Trees, so obviously I was not going to find that tree, but it was just sort of the search, and so the picture really becomes about the sort of failed love and sort of this tragic experience, and just actually this fall or this winter I had the opportunity to go back west when I was on break for a couple weeks, and this image is recent. Then I made, this is actually the Bonneville Salt Flats, which also connects to that. Matthew Barney actually filmed part of the Cremaster 2 and enacted a rodeo with Gary Gilmore as a sort of trial scene, and I was intrigued by that story as well. And just this area is where quite a number of artists have made these land works, and so it's very intriguing and pretty spooky part of the country. Another image of just the incredible sense of the way you can just almost disappear into this landscape, and you feel it's so open, and there's just sort of nothingness, and it's a pretty kind of amazing feeling to be in those places. And in Moab, Arizona. And I think, one of the most American things about me probably is this fact that I take so many pictures of motel signs. I mean, that, and I like ice in my drinks and ketchup in my fries, but the motel pictures are part of that too. And on this particular trip, I took a lot of when I travel, I take a lot of pictures on my phone too, and mostly this is just for me as kind of note taking, but I feel like these iPhone pictures are similar to like the Polaroids of the 70s, and there's something really appealing to me about the format and the instant gratification, just the kind of casual way you can make pictures. And So this is a collection of some of the pictures that I made on my phone, and a number of these are going to be published actually this spring in a 2-page magazine spread, which is the first time that I've in an Austrian photo magazine. That's the first time I've ever really done anything with these pictures, just outside of like making books for myself and having them. But going back to the American stills, like stepping back in time again, during this process of traveling and making these landscape images, I started photographing people as well, and not in a kind of defined portrait project, but more just people I encountered and had a reaction to. This is in Crawford, Texas. These young women. Crawford, Texas is the former home of the George Bush ranch, his like off-season dwelling place, or the once was, and that's the claim to fame to Crawford, Texas, which is a tiny little conservative Texas town. And this is in Austin, actually on Christmas Day, 2008, I think. So I had begun to get back into taking pictures of people after a really long time of not doing that. And another place in Austin that I spent a lot of time at and made images of people is Barton Springs, which is a natural swimming hole, and so it was a good place to be able to find people. And Robert Redford described it as the spiritual center of Austin, and I felt like it was a place where I was able to approach people and have those kind of experiences. So that this image is at Barton Springs, and this one really kind of stuck with me. This adolescent, kind of androgynous adolescent boy. I called this picture Jesus Boy for a long time, just because he had he has that look of kind of a Western Jesus figure. But that kind of carried into what became a more focused portrait series that I started in 2008. And I was seeing somebody who lived in Binghamton, New York, and had started making bus trips in the summer. In 2008, was the fall of 2008, was the beginning of the recession in America, and it was also the time that Obama was running for election for the first time. And this portrait series I started, Ballad of Sad Young Men, kind of came out of conversation with a friend about the song The Ballad of Sad Young Men and its historical significance in the gay community. And really what the song is about is kind of the struggle and uncertainty of adolescence. And so this project for me became a way of kind of revisiting my own experiences as an adolescent growing up in a Midwestern town and coming to terms with my sexuality and the struggle. And I started approaching young men on the street and asking them if I could make pictures of them. And the process, I would just spend a whole day driving up and down Main Street looking for people young men who just kind of, I felt something about them that I responded to. And so really what I was looking for was both their sort of strength and vulnerability. And that's sort of what I was bringing to it personally, but also thinking about this particular time in American life that was especially challenging. In young people, there's a greater degree of uncertainty with America's economic reality. So there are the different themes of the kind of larger economic environment, and then my own personal themes that I was bringing to this project. So then this was exhibited in the winter at a gallery called Dan Cooney in New York. It was a 2-person exhibition with a photographer named Francesca Romeo, and she worked for the Mars Bar, and she owned the Mars Bar in New York, and photographed her milieu of friends. And so the gallerists like paired our work together, and sort of connections and differences, and that has led to a kind of long-term friendship between us. And after that project was done, I wanted to continue to make portraits. But for a while, I was just sort of not sure, where or what the kind of connection would be between. And I had started teaching in the fall of 2009 at a school called William Patterson University, which is in a suburb of a city called Patterson. And on the way to school, my colleague and I drove through Patterson. I saw it for the first time, and it's this actually one of the oldest cities in America. It's the first planned industrial city. It was founded by Alexander Hamilton and a group of entrepreneurs because of its setting at the Great Falls of the Passaic River. And it was once a very prosperous silk manufacturing city that had really slid into economic decline in the later part of the 20th century. And I felt like it really spoke to me about the larger phenomena of American economic reality and post-industrial cities. And so I made my first bus trip in the fall of 2009 from New York. I would started going to Port Authority and just taking the bus, and I would walk up and down Main Street, and the whole, both with Binghamton and with Patterson, this idea of Main Street became both like a literal space and a metaphoric space about working class Americans, which the Main Street was coming up in the media in terms of this dialogue about American reality. So when I started this project, I would have had no idea that I would then spend the next several years of my life like revisiting Patterson over and over again, and probably in the 4.5 years that I worked on this project, I probably went there at least 100 times and photographed maybe 100 more people, and the process was basically just approaching somebody once I had that kind of feeling or connection or empathy, affinity to them, and saying, I'm a photographer from New York and I'm working on a portrait, documentary portrait series about Patterson, and I think he'd be an interesting person to photograph. And that's sort of how it began. And the relationship with these individuals really, is unique to each encounter. For example, with this man, Alexei, I got to know him really well, and over the course of years, and I would say we became friends, and we had a very affectionate relationship. He had used to identify as a transgender person, and now identifies as a gay man. And I remember asking him, what's it like to be gay in Patterson? He said, "Girl, people love me." And we had a very warm relationship. So this was an earlier photograph, and this is a few years later. Actually, last spring. So some of the influences, I guess, or other artists that I was thinking about, they're not all photographers. I mean, some of the photographers that I had in mind, of course, were thinking about the American Depression era photographers like Dorothea Lange, Walker Evans, and Russell B., Gordon Parks. Also thinking about, in a more contemporary sense, Paul Graham, and but some of the other influences were more literary. I read a number of times Junot Díaz's The Brief and Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde, which is about a young man who grows up in Patterson. Junot Díaz himself, who was a Dominican-American writer, grew up in Patterson. And Oscar is this kind of like loser character, but lovable, passionate, overweight science fiction nerd who's always falling in love with people who don't love him back, and he's a sort of wonderful character. And that was a muse for me. Another film that was really important to me is Fassbender film. Sorry, the name slip. It's a film about a German woman, an older German woman, who falls in love with a Moroccan man, and they're sort of ostracized by their community, and it's a very simply told film about discrimination and difference, and that feeling of being kind of outside society. And it's just the way it was shot and the way it was told that was impactful to me. So these are all made medium format. I would walk for hours, so I didn't even bring a tripod. I was hand holding this film, and I was thinking both in the making, the way that I was framing these and making these, I was not so much trying to create an environmental portrait, but combining this sort of social realism with kind of classical portraiture, so that there's an element of that it looks like a painting, or kind of a backdrop photograph. So the emphasis is really on the subject and their expression, and trying to tell the story through their faces, even more than in the environment. So oftentimes it's using a very shallow depth of field, and kind of isolating the subject from the larger context. And I think you still get a sense of Paterson, and a sense of place, but it's the emphasis really on the individuals. But this detail, for example, the barbershop was one aspect of Paterson that I did want to incorporate in the series, because I felt like it's such a specific element of Paterson architecture. A lot of with its kind of economic decline, a lot of the way the economy there is supported by small businesses like barbershops and beauty salons and nail salons and restaurants, and then there is a very high rate of unemployment in Paterson. And actually, just this week, my class went to a field trip at the Museum of Contemporary Art, and some of us watched a film by Alan Sikola, The Forgotten Space, and he has in the film created conversations. He's taped conversations and filmed people who are living in a tent community in Los Angeles who were unemployed, and some of the conversations that he had was really bringing back some of my conversations with people in Paterson. And people tend to open up a lot, I think, when in the experience of being photographed. People, there's an intimacy that's created, and that people would share these pretty intense stories with me. And certainly I considered there's the possibility of incorporating the stories, but I felt like I made the decision that I was really just focusing on the portraits and the storytelling through them, without the text, and without, I was asking them, can I make a picture without asking them for the stories. So it remained just simply a portrait series. This is a woman named Brandy who actually approached me. She had seen me photographing somebody else, and asked if I would photograph her as well, and we walked around and found a place to make this picture. And so sometimes there's kind of sense of a collaboration with the subject about where and how, and she also, this is with someone that she was engaged to, and she had asked me if I would take engagement photos of them. And in that process of taking pictures for her, this is an image that kind of also emerged, I felt, for me. And a woman named Nakia, who is a hairdresser on Dr. Martin Luther King Drive. Yeah.
How do you direct your subjects when you?
So I mean, I try to not do a lot of directing. I mean, I do want to convey pretty strong sense of realism, and you know, I might ask somebody to just like, you know, can you move a little, or can you look at me, or can you, but mostly I'm trying, you know, I'm entirely using natural light, and I'm, you know, not asking them to, you know, stand a certain way, or, you know, really it's just kind of a
They
little,
sort of-
mostly it's just about getting that, like seeing the face and getting that connection.
They sort of unfurl naturally.
Yeah.
Like it seems like the strength in these portraits is that it feels like so natural and like a really connection to you. And you know, it's very difficult to work with strangers because we don't know, you know, like what to say, or they might not trust you. So I'm just wondering, like, is that process difficult, or is it
Well-
that psychological tension part of it?
Yeah, I mean, you know, the images that you're seeing are obviously the images of the people that have agreed to participate being photographed, and so there's a lot of approaching people that, you know, that didn't. So a lot of it was finding the people that I could establish that connection with and who were willing. And you know, and there's an interesting phenomenon, I think, that people do feel something when they're noticed, and they, you know, there is an intimacy that you know, in some cases could be created and sometimes quickly created. Does anybody else have any questions?
Sometimes it happens that you have a subject that you don't get a good picture that you.
What's that?
Does it happen that you ask somebody and it doesn't turn out as any picture that you like because it just doesn't happen?
Yeah, no, I mean, I photographed, you know, there are a lot of, you know, I usually would photograph, like take several rolls of a subject, and, you know, it was maybe 1 out of 10 people that I photographed that I actually then, like, found one image that I was interested in. So there's a lot of photographing people, you know, there are a lot of people I photographed that you're not seeing, and then there's a lot of finding that one image amongst many images that I wanted. Yeah, I mean, it wasn't just this is not just like the one photograph I took a lot of pictures and tried to find, you know, the one that had the strength in their expression.
The
And this, yeah,
medium format?
yeah, it's
Without
medium.
without a tripod?
Without a tripod, yeah, I mean,
Rangefinder?
it is, walking, for, you know, 4+ hours, even with a medium format camera, and, you know, through a city up and down, like, you know, I would go up and down Main Street and then go on these various arteries of Main Street, like Dr. Martin Luther King Drive and Market Street, and it was very exhausting, and, you know, so it was like I had to kind of lose the tripod, and I was also usually going kind of in between, you know, noon and 6 o'clock, or, you know, 7 o'clock, and but yeah, I mean, I had these certain limitations to how I could make these pictures exist, and then I had to work within those sort of technical limitations. I mean, a lot of the previous work, like the landscapes, is shot on a tripod, and, you know, I have a car and I have the tripod with me. But this particular process, you know, I really had to kind of pare it down for it to actually happen. And this is actually the last spring, I finished the project before I moved here, and this is the last image that I took, and actually one of my favorite images. And so this image of Kathy was the image that was included in this. It was a finalist in 2013 for a national portrait competition that takes place every 2 years through the Smithsonian. And when you submit, you can only submit one image for consideration. So this was the one at that time that really spoke to me the most about the project. I submitted it, and then it got into this competition and was exhibited at the Smithsonian for a year. And to mention some other things that have happened with this project, in 2012 2012, it received a grant from a combination of organizations, just an annual grant for women working photography. It's Women in Photography individual project grant that's supported by Lightside, a lab in New York City, and another organization called Humble Arts Foundation. And the image of Kathy also won a prize in the photo review competition 2013. So these two images were published in the competition issue. And it was also, the series was included in a digital exhibition and website called Making Pictures of People, which is actually something that's I've shown the larger website in class, and it was it's a website that incorporates portraiture by about 27 photographers. And so if you go onto the site and you can click on the links to each of the photographers' series. And that's the installation of the digital exhibition in the museum. And then last spring, before I left, or last year, I got this residency through a nonprofit organization called Baxter Street CCNY. And I had 3 months of access to facilities, and now I'm actually going to have an exhibition as the kind of culmination of that residency in New York with this organization in June. And in addition to making my work in photography, for the past many years, I've also been doing a lot of curating and writing about photography. So I have these kind of combined practices. From 2009 to 2013, I was the curator and writer for a curated online resource for contemporary art called Culture Hall. And my former colleague and I developed the site, the community on the site, and I did a lot of outreach to artists to bring their work onto the site, and then I wrote about their work. And these are what we called featured issues, where 4 of the artists would be highlighted every 2 weeks or eventually every month. And it was a bit like the idea of curating a group show, where I would have a curatorial thread and I would find artists like surrounding that curatorial thread. So for example, this one is called Traces, and I'll just read one paragraph. The 4 artists presented in this issue engage in photography's dialogue with mortality and memory, presence and absence, visibility and invisibility. Through individual methods of photographing physical environments, each artist blurs the distinction between what exists and what is imagined or felt. Their relationships to the external world reflect personal investigations into themes of death, dreams, desire, attachment, and transformation. In some works, they look for evidence left behind, even when it's not visible on the even where it's not visible on the surface. And in others, they transfigure spaces to express internal realities. So then I go on and write about each individual artist's work and how their work relates to this theme. And so they have a highlighted image on the homepage, and if you click on that image, it goes to a portfolio of their series. So that was one. Another one I did in the 4.5 years that I worked for the site. I probably wrote and curated and wrote or co-wrote about 40 of these. I'm just going to show you a few. Another one's called Other Places, and I brought together different generations of LGBT artists making work about LGBT identity and community. One is Kelly Connell, who I think some of you know her work. Molly Landerith, who did a project called Queer America, where she photographed LGBT people around the country. Omar Gomez, who photographed these kind of environments for gay men to congregate in Mexico. And Doug Ishar, who was my former professor at the University of Illinois, and a body of work he made in the 80s documenting one of the first gay beaches in Chicago, or one of the first gay beaches in the country, which was in Chicago. So these go to their portfolio. And this particular show also was shown as a physical exhibition in New York at another photo organization. And another one called America, that was published on 4th of July 2010. As 4th of July approaches, Cultural Hall features artists whose provocative work challenges us to consider or reconsider the American experience. These 4 artists draw from a variety of sources: personal relationships, historical representations, cross-country tours to examine our national identity through their images. When viewed together, their work collectively asks us to look at America's religious groups, its vast working class, its legacies of sexism and homophobia, and the impact of its foreign wars. The pictures of America, real and imagined, recognize diversity, complexity, inequality, humanity. And so then I'm, tying in these 4 artists' work. So I don't want to bore you guys with too much information. That's essentially, what I did. And all of these various forms of writing are on my website. So exhibition reviews and articles, interviews with artists, and then this
All
list
your
of
articles
these.
are online.
So yeah, so these are all links on my webpage to the Culture Hall features and interviews with artists, and I also wrote exhibition reviews for some magazines in New York. And that, that's how I started to establish my experience or identity in writing, and that led to writing for some magazines about photography. For the past couple of years, I've written for each issue of PDN EDU, which is Photo District News. EDU, it's a magazine for photo educators and students. And the editor would, give me topics that she felt were sort of relevant to my work, my interests. So this is Showing Truth with the Camera. It's about a project with NGOs and having students work with NGOs and nonprofits. The Astoria Project, which is is a project having students document their communities in Queens. I wrote an article about organizing TEDx talks and events in your community, and talking about TED Talks that are relevant to photo educators. And then I wrote about a project where photographers around the world volunteer to photograph people who can't afford to have portraits made of themselves. So that organization is called Help Portrait. And then in the past year, I've been writing for a magazine called American Photo Magazine. And so for every 2 months, I research photo exhibitions around the United States and find about 12 or so, and then highlight one of those exhibitions for the main page, and then try to write these sort of short clips about these other exhibitions. So the process starts with having this huge list of galleries and museums around the United States, and going through and sort of researching what's ahead, and then trying to find interesting shows, and then trying to find, so it's not an exhibition review in the sense that I haven't actually seen the exhibition because it's not up yet. I'm writing it months ahead, but then researching the work and then trying to kind of summarize it in a very concise way. So this style of writing for all of these sites is really called short form arts writing, and I've really, I study, I really like the writing in the New Yorker magazine about exhibitions, so I actually read these exhibition reviews, both as a photographer, but also as someone writing about photography. And it's like a puzzle to try to figure out how do you talk about an exhibition, make it interesting to people in this, paragraph. So this was highlighted Jen Davis's exhibition last spring at Clamp Art in New York City. And then, among the other exhibitions I mentioned are Richard Rinaldi's Touching Strangers exhibition and a number of others. And this featured a show in the fall at the Smithsonian about the idea of it was, what is cool, what's the identity of cool in American photography. And so it's a mix of both, fine art and pictures that were made in more kind of commercial editorial photographs. And then more recently, this is current. I featured Larry Sultan's exhibition at the in Los Angeles. This is his first retrospective. Some of you may know his work. He's a really major American photographer who died a number of years ago, and he did a project, Pictures from Home, and then this project is on the sex industry in California. So that is more or less, that's the end of my talk, and now I'll just kind of open it up and see if you guys have questions either about the photographs or the writing projects. Yeah.
I have a question about the first series you showed us, the American Stills.
Yeah.
How do you choose the cities you want to photograph?
How do I choose what?
Cities.
The cities?
Revolution.
So yeah, I mean, some of it is, okay, like it really, it would be, well, the Gibsonton, going to Florida was again like motivated. I mean, the story is even honestly weirder than that. I was photographing in a northern Minnesota, when I still lived in Minnesota, and I was just kind of wandering. I actually gave a talk at this school in northern Minnesota and left and had a car and was driving around this abandoned amusement park. And it was a miniature abandoned amusement park, and I was like, this is really amazing. It was like this desolate, and I'm looking through the camera, and this tiny man who's a dwarf appears in my frame, and I was like, and then we started talking, and it was just like such a magical and sort of surreal experience, and he was the one who told me about Gibsonton, so it was like, that was such a kind of potent experience with him, and I actually, moved to New York and then called him, and it just stayed with me, like I wanted to go, and so that was the motivation for going to Gibsonton. And then the Austin, because of having family there, it created a way that I could be there, but then I would drive around and explore, all the surroundings. And so it's, kind of different for each place. But a lot of it, again, as I mentioned, was just things that I read, articles that I read, novels that I read, pieces of history, and that would just create a kind of a map for, yeah.
I just had a question about your relationship with portraiture and the subject. I was just wondering how you consider the subject, if it was sort of a tribute, if you were seeking to express some internal emotion, or if you're looking for the subject to sort of express themselves.
I am definitely looking for them to express themselves. I mean, I want a sense of this being. I can't say this is who they are. I mean, who they are is very subjective. But I want it to be my impression. I mean, obviously, a portrait. I think any portrait is like part subject, part artist. And it's the thing that's intriguing to me about portrait making is that it depends on this kind of meeting place of the artist's feelings and identity and the subject's feelings and identity. And so I think of it, sort of equal parts.
Yeah.
But I can't, I wouldn't say like this is who somebody is, because this is just my one, interpretation and that, and yeah.
I have a kind of multi-part question.
Okay.
I read in an interview in the Making Pictures of People.
Yeah.
You said that you were drawn to the experience of connecting with people, especially overcoming difference, and what might set you apart from them. I guess I'm wondering about, what about that you're interested in, or whether you see yourself or identify with your subjects, or how that relationship works, and especially in terms of themes of poverty and race and economic injustice. I guess I'm wondering if it's a social critique, or how, if you want that message to be in your images. And then I guess the other part of my question is, do you work with model releases, or how do you talk to your subjects about the what photos are destined for, or, and do they ever see them, or have any kind of?
Yeah, so yeah, that's,
into
it's
that
the
sort of-
stuff I, kind of neglected to mention that, yes, I would bring these pictures back with me, like I would make contact sheets and small prints. And, in most cases, be able to, Patterson is not very big, and I would eventually spend so much time there, go back and have these images and show people images and give them prints. And I was able to do that with most of the people that I photographed. And and it also grew into being like, some of these people I photographed more than once or twice, and this sort of, the relationship developed in time. And then they would see the pictures and be aware of it. And I always was pretty just straightforward about what is the project. I would just say I'm working on a portrait series, a documentary portrait series in Patterson, and, I don't go into a lot of depth about it initially. I mean, people would start to understand what I was doing, and then would even ask me, like, how's the project going? In time, it was definitely a kind of relationship with the city and community that evolved through time and experience, and the relationships with people deepening. And yes, I do feel like, yes, it is a project that is very much about, economic struggle and the reality of, this sort of, for me, that at this time that I started working on this project, the dialogue about the recession and the sort of disparity between increasing disparity of wealth and poverty in the United States was hugely on my mind, and I really felt like I couldn't see myself making work about anything else. It was just like, it was so much about, this is the reality of America right now, and this is my reality. I don't equate my own struggles necessarily with some of the struggles of the people I photographed, but it certainly was, they're very real economic struggles, being an artist and a teacher, and very, during the recession. And so, but yeah, I felt like the project, like Patterson spoke to me because it was clearly a city that was struggling in the way that so many American cities are struggling in this kind of post-industrial environment. And so yes. But did that answer all parts of your question?
That's great.
Okay.
Do you have any Canadian towns or cities you're gonna visit?
Well, I don't know. I haven't really got there yet since I've been here. I had started taking pictures just in my area in Montreal a bit in the fall, but really only a couple pictures that I was interested in yet. So I'm not sure if what exactly will develop if I do photograph in Montreal or in Canada. I'm not sure yet.
Have you ever taken pictures in other countries?
I have taken pictures when I just go, like sort of more like travel pictures, or when I went to Taiwan for 3 weeks in, I think it was 2003, and I took a ton of pictures then. I have a lot of that work, but it doesn't really connect to this work. So for example, I don't have it on my website. I have lots of prints and images, but it doesn't really feel like it was a project. But it was, I like some of the images a lot, and that taking pictures in another country here or elsewhere might happen. But obviously all of these works are very connected by their exploration of America.
What was the name of that circus town in Florida?
Oh, Gibsonton.
Gibsonton. I've
Yeah, it's
spent a
near
lot-
Tampa.
Oh, near Tampa.
Yeah.
Do you plan to pursue more of your more recent works that you've done this year?
What's
To
that?
keep on working on those images?
You mean the images that I took in Utah? I feel like it's really gonna be, where I'm able to, I think it's gonna reveal itself to me about where I'm able to go, whether I start to really just continue to photograph, like, the United States when I have the opportunity to be in the United States, or whether I'm gonna photograph here, or whether I'm gonna do both. I'm sort of still in the early stages of figuring that out, here, whether, I'm gonna just you know, I mean, I suspect it'll probably be trying to do both things, yeah.
Your photographs are obviously very unique, each photograph is unique to you, but also your subjects. I mean, this is a very unique event for your subjects. I mean, nobody stops on the street and asks you to be photographed. So it's a very unique encounter. What types of feedback? Was there anything, any common denominator in the feedback that you got from these people that you would approach? Is there, you know, like, to have that unique experience?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, like I do think people, I mean, there are certainly people who have a kind of like a no way reaction, but then when there's the people that are interested in it, I think they're flattered, they're kind of moved, and they're curious. I think curiosity, there's kind of like, why did you notice me, and what do you want to do, and what's this for? And then we would start to just talk, and like I said, I think the experience of being photographed would oftentimes make people become extremely open about things and be telling me very personal and, you know, sometimes very difficult things about themselves very quickly in a way that you wouldn't normally open up to a stranger. So there's a very strong sense of intimacy or trust that seemed to be, you know, created through this process. And for me, it was really like the experience of human connection, like that was like the driving force. Like, I mean, initially when I started shooting in Patterson, I thought about photographing the environment as well, and I did initially actually take pictures, you know, of I mean, there's a famous American photographer, George Tice, who's done 2 books about what Patterson 1, Patterson 2, which is mostly like the storefronts, the architecture, the falls, and the old buildings and so on. But for me, it was really like the human connection, the people, the human experience, talking about, you know, this sort of American reality, but through people, and for me to actually connect to them. That was really powerful. So, I mean, for that whole amount of time, I just, you know, all I could do was make portraits.
Because you seem to have captured a moment of vulnerability in every single subject that I've seen here tonight. You seem to capture that, a certain essence of vulnerability, and I just thought it was fabulous.
Thanks.
Well, that vulnerability kind of put, like, who are they looking at, or us as a viewer, and the privilege maybe, especially when I think about the space of the gallery or the prize it will get in what will be happen after to the photo is always questionable, especially when it's documentary or it's realism, tracing what is happening and where does the work going is questionable for me, and the privilege for the spectator, or I don't know, there is social struggle and ethical issue in here, but what is it happening with? I'm not sure.
Okay. But are you asking me?
Yeah, enlighten me about that. Yeah. What do you think? Do you think they through those kind of documentary or documenting the vulnerability, or is it important where it's exhibited or shown, and who is looking at it, the spectator of it? Is there any privilege behind?
Right. Well, I mean, I think that what you're saying at, those are all important questions and issues. That is, you know, partly true of just the nature of, you know, documentary and art photography and who sees it in general. Like those questions, like we have a structure of, you know, museums and galleries, and unfortunately there is a reality of that oftentimes there's a certain privilege of people who are able to participate in the art viewing experience. So I get what you're saying. I think that I mean, for me actually, having it shown in the museum was a really rewarding context for it because it's free to go to a museum. It's a space for the public, and it wasn't for sale like during the exhibition. It wasn't about, you know, that wasn't a factor in it. It was purely for the public to experience. You know, I did what I could in terms of trying to bring my images back to the people that I photographed. But I think it's, you know, it's what you're saying, I think, is partly a bigger like issue about
For
you know,
example,
photographs that are in you know, an art context, there is an audience that of privilege that generally gets to see these images, but that, I don't think that that's unique to, you know, this project, for example.
I mean, the fact that you go back and give the photos back, to me, it seems like a two ways. Like, there is this vulnerability, one take a picture, and this one doesn't own its own picture, and the picture is owned by some other hierarchical, I don't know, system. But the other way, that this person also owns his own picture, it seems, for me, more like valuable. Like, it's a very impressive, like a very simple thing to give back the picture, but it really changes and shift the ownership of the picture and its own image of the person. I think it's quite important to mention.
I mean, you know, when I did go back with Kathy, who was the subject that was in the photograph in the Smithsonian. I went back to her many times to talk to her about that whole process, and I brought her a catalog so she could see her photograph, you know, in the catalog. And you had asked about model releases, JJ, and I didn't answer that question, I don't think. But I did actually, I would actually ask people to sign model releases, but it was not purely for the reason of I mean, I've only once in my life ever used a model release and needed one, so I felt like it's somewhat irrelevant, or felt somewhat irrelevant to have them, but it was a way of recording information, so I would know who I photographed, and I would write down just notes about them, or if they had an email address, if there's some way. I mean, I have some continued, you know, connection with some of the people that I've photographed. Whether, I mean, even, you know, Facebook or emails or phone calls or whatever. So there, you know, I tried to keep a record of who I photographed.
Any other questions? Well, maybe at this point, you'll join me in thanking Tema for